Grounding and bonding the boat for lightning protection. So this is something I wanted to do for a while. I wasn't planning to do a video on this because, well, let's face it, this is a contentious topic. There's a lot of opinions out there, not a lot of facts. What we do know is based on mainly statistics and some theory. As well as the fact that some places will have more lightning than others, so you're more likely to get struck in some places. And despite the fact that I'm highly unlikely to get struck, I'm going to do it anyway. So I do want to cite my references for some of the things that I'm going to do and say. Mainly I've utilized the ABYC recommendations, also the work of Ewan Thompson of the University of Florida. And his work can be accessed simply by just Googling Ewan Thompson scholarly articles, which might be a little technical for the average person, but there's a website whose address I'll post that summarizes it pretty well. Also, these two books written by well-known authors, this one by Don Casey and this one by Nigel Calder. This one's been superseded. And lastly, before I get started, I want to go over some of the misinformation and why I'm doing what I'm doing. There is no evidence that grounding a boat actually attracts lightning. The purpose of grounding an aluminum mast is, number one, to reduce the chances of being struck by equalizing the charge potential of the boat with the surrounding water. And number two, to actually give lightning a path in case you do get struck, to minimize the damage to the hull. Statistically, a boat that is stationary is much more likely to be struck than a boat that's moving. Static dissipators. There are a lot of people that believe in these, but there are multiple studies that show these make no statistical difference in preventing a strike. And in theory, since they ionize the air around them, they could actually attract a strike, but who knows, probably not. If you understand the science, what you're proposing is that you're able to dissipate the static from your boat, but the problem with that is that your boat is in water and any dissipated static is just replaced. You can't dissipate the static from the ocean. Again, a lot of people believe in these, and I've seen at least one well-known YouTube channel recommend them, despite admitting to having been struck no less than 3 times, and at least one of those times on the dissipator itself. If my boat had a metal keel, I would simply attach a wire or a strap from the keel to the mast and call it a day. However, my boat has an encapsulated iron keel, so I need to attach a plate to the outside. The sintered bronze plates that are actually meant for grounding a radio are not suitable for grounding a boat for lightning. There are numerous warnings out there for this, and yet retailers are still advertising them for this purpose. When they are used for lightning and they do get struck, they can and do explode because the bronze is porous, and when the lightning enters the plate, it causes the water in the pores to turn to steam and it explodes. And in one documented case, there's actually hull damage where the boat was taking on water. So selecting a grounding plate, at least the way I do it, ABYC standards dictates that a copper ground plate needs to be at least a square foot in area, at least 3/16 inch thick, made of copper, of course, have a sharp edge around the perimeter, and the perimeter be a minimum of 48 inches. So this is an example of one that I have which is not suitable. It is more than 48 inches in perimeter, and it is more than 3/16 thick and made of copper, but the edges are round, and it's less than 1 square foot. It's actually half a square foot because this is, I believe, 3 inches by 24 inches. So here's an example of one that I have that is suitable. This is 3/16 thick, sharp edges, made of copper, and it's 1 square foot. It's, I believe, 4 inches wide by 36 inches long, and that gives me much more perimeter than the required 48 inches. And that's important because when the lightning enters the grounding plate, it actually exits from the edges. So the more edge you have, the better. And because a sailboat in freshwater is statistically 10 times more likely to sustain hull damage from a lightning strike, what a lot of people will do is forego a plate and rather use a very long strip of 12 feet long by 1 inches wide, thereby giving you 24 feet of edge around the perimeter. I'm not a freshwater sailor, so I'm going with the regular grounding plate. And a word about the wiring here. So I'm planning to ground the 3 chain plates, which are obviously attached to the shrouds to the top of the mast. And those are going to go to the grounding plate. So ABYC standards say a minimum of 6 gauge for secondary grounding, which is what that would be. This is brand new 6 gauge wire. I did have my old battery cables that I entertained using, but I'm not sure of the condition, and I did get a really good deal on this wiring, but I had to go with red because that's all they had available due to supply chain issues. Also, I'll be bonding, and the difference between grounding and bonding, but the bonding part is to reduce the chance of a side strike. So if the lightning did enter the boat via the cable to the ground plate, there's a chance that it could actually flash to the side if it's attracted to a large piece of metal, such as a stove or an inboard engine, which is actually connected to the water through the prop. So you would think that it's already grounded, which it is. But the problem there is that internal components are coated with oil, and that can make it resistive. Also, you really want to discourage any sort of current from following to the water through the engine, because it would really destroy the bearings if that happened. So that's the reason I'm also bonding the engine. Okay, enough talk. So you can see I marked out where the chain plates are on the floor, or at least where the straight line down to the floor. And I've begun with running the ground wires in here. See that red one attached to the forward chain plate. Here's the midship chain plate, and you can see they run through. I had to drill a hole here at the base of the pedestal that holds up the head, and I'm going to have to epoxy that because there's actually wood coring in there. And then a bit more difficult was this aft chain plate here on the starboard side. Had to actually tear out the FRP panel that I had put in here for this ice box. And of course, it's attached here to the chain plate. So there's a number of challenges with this particular boat for this project. The main one being this liner here, which is actually part of the sole, the cabin sole. So I have devised a way to get through that. I was able to replace that panel relatively easily. Just cut it to size and sealed it with 5200. And I will paint it with cabin coat like it was before, once that's dry. And next step was to run the bonding wires, which, unlike the grounding wires, well, grounding wires really should avoid tight turns, although I don't really have any tight turns in this. So this one goes to the stove, mounted here, and doing this also allows me to use the stove as a Faraday cage to put electronics in there to protect from being wiped out by lightning. And then the engine So you can see the red wire there where I mounted it to the water pump, I believe. And that'll run here under the cabin sole and ultimately to where the grounding plate will be. And next would be to run the ground wire for the mast through the deck down here, down this bulkhead. But it appears that they sent me the wrong ground wire. It's not marine grade or tinned, so I had to send that back and wait to get a new one. But in the meantime, I'll move forward with the grounding plate. And to locate that grounding plate, I've marked the location of the chain plates there in blue tape. The middle one is obviously equal to where the mast is. So originally I was wanting to put it very close to the water line, but this presents a few problems. Number one, obviously if the boat heels, it sticks out of the water, and then if I go any further, then you have the depth sounder. On the other side there's a through hull, so it looks like I'll be mounting it over there in the flat part of the keel. This is actually where the center bilge is, so I'll be able to access it without any problem. So yeah, that's, I think, the best place for it. And now I've got it dry fitted with those 8 bolts, which are a 1/4 inch thick each. So to help with waterproofing this, I drilled the holes for those bolts a little smaller than the diameter of the bolt itself, so that when I screw it in, it would actually tap its own thread. And so that's for the 2 front shrouds, aft shroud, that's for bonding, and then I'm going to be putting a larger one here for the mast itself. And on the inside of the bilge, you can see where the screws from the ground plate are protruding. So I mentioned that I can't really get wires under the sole here because this contacts the hull. So with the exception of this one little spot here, I was able to get the bonding wire for the stove through, and it'll attach to there. This is the bonding wire for the engine. So my plan here is an alternative to wire is actually 1/2 inch copper tubing. And since lightning or electricity actually travels on the outer part of a wire, tubing makes sense. But in this case, I'm using tubing that I flattened in a vise. Although I probably could have did a better job of bending this, but this is kind of a prototype. And it'll go in here and actually slides in there. So I'm going to drill holes there. And then this is the aft shroud wire, and it'll attach to that copper strap. And that's the first one. So that copper pipe, which I've turned into a strap, is now bolted, or at least dry fitted, to the outside grounding plate. Benefit of doing it this way is that this will allow me to seal it much better, 4200 or whatever. Of course on the outside as well. But from there, it'll bolt right into this. Can't even see, it's too dark. But once I get the hardware for that, I'll bolt that in at the end. And now I've got them all dry fitted. That is the shrouds. The strap for the shrouds. You can see the forward one way over there. It's only got 1 bolt going through it. But this is the midship shroud. This is the aft shroud. And this, of course, is the bonding for the stove and the engine. I did use another piece of copper strap just as kind of a backing. So I like this setup because I get 2 bolts going into the grounding plate, for excess current. The bolts are, I mentioned, 1/4 inch. I might go a little heavier if I could find something heavier, maybe 3/8, but I think a 1/4 inch will do. So now I need to wait for my cable, the main cable for the mast grounding. And I do have plenty of copper tubing, 1/2-inch copper tubing left to make a strap for that as well. I need to figure out how I'm going to do that, because the run from the mast to the plate needs to be pretty direct with very little bends, if any. So I'll wait for that to arrive. Okay, about a week later, I finally did receive the right cable that I need. This is for the primary grounding for the mast. And ABYC standards recommends at least 4 gauge. I went much heavier. This is 0 gauge. And notice that I left off one of the lugs here, and that's so I can actually get it through the deck, because this would kind of interfere, so I'll attach the lug later. Also, I mentioned I needed to work out how to run the cable and the strap directly with minimal bends from the mast. And you can see I've already attached the strap. These stainless bolts are just temporary. I'm going to be using much heavier bronze bolts. But it comes up. I had to pry up the floor with a screwdriver and then cut a slot here in the cabin sole. And the strap comes up, makes a little bit of a bend. And you can see the lug I've already temporarily attached. The cable comes straight up through the deck and then attached to the mast. Okay, now I've got the hole drilled to pass through the deck, and up top, obviously it's a little offset from the mast, but this is going to be long enough that there won't be much of a turn. I'm going to use one of these through the deck things, which I originally had here, and then replace with these plug-in types. I actually had to drill this a lot bigger because that wire is pretty thick. So I'll just put it in there and seal it. I've now fully installed that pass-through. So this is all solid fiberglass except for right here. This is where the wood coring starts. So I had to over drill that, fill it with epoxy, and then drill it again to protect the wood core. And this is nice and long, so it'll go and attach to the mast here without much of a bend, which is what we want. And because this is likely to get kicked and bumped in this position, or rather in its location, I've used 5200 here as a sealer and for extra strength to hold that down. And now I've got it fully dry fitted. As you can see, I use a very heavy, or 2 heavy bronze bolts. They are 1/2 inch diameter, which coincides with the 1/2 inch copper pipe. Even though that's been flattened, it's the same diameter. And the heavy cable, which I have yet to attach to the lug, is almost 1/2 inch in diameter. And here at the grounding plate, you can see the 2 heavy bolts for the mast are next to the machine screws for the midship shroud. So at this point, now that it's all dry fitted, I'm going to take this apart and work on sealing it for leaks. Okay, so I've removed the grounding plate, sanded away the bottom paint to the barrier coat, and then went into each hole with some unthickened epoxy to go over the raw fiberglass that's in there. And then after that went in again with some thickened epoxy to form more of a barrier and to give the screws something more to bite into. I'm using 3M 4200. And now everything's been sealed with 4200 behind the strap and the bus bar. And also I added one more bonding wire to this bus bar, which I forgot to do before, and that's coming from the stanchion. And that stanchion is obviously connected to the pull pit and the push pit via the lifelines, and that should bond that whole area. So all I have left now is to cut all these screws and bolts flush. Also cleaning up the mess from the sealant. I scraped off a lot of the bilge paint, so I'm going to have to redo that. And I'm also probably going to just use bilge paint to paint over the copper and the bolts as a kind of a preventative for corrosion, although they will corrode eventually. And of course I've sealed the outside on the grounding plate. So at this point I am now statistically safer from lightning. No, but I think this will prove its worth at some point, or maybe not. But one thing I did not mention before is that there's a website, lightningmaps.org, that shows you real-time information on a satellite map of where lightning is striking at any given time. Also, I thought about grounding the shrouds on the other side, but that likely would need to have yet another grounding plate, but I think that might be overkill. I think what I have here is probably good. And I also want to end this video with an old joke that Don Casey says in one of his books, which is essentially what lightning protection is like. And that's an old joke about a man playing a trumpet in a park, and somebody calls the police on him, and when the police arrive, they say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm keeping the elephants away." So the police say, "But sir, there are no elephants within thousands of miles." And the man says, "See,